Kala never learned what it meant to wake gently. Long before the rooster cried out or the first thread of dawn broke the dark, her body learned to stiffen, to brace, to flinch before the pain came. The slap was never loud, never hard enough to leave her bleeding, but it was always sharp, always precise. Her stepfather, Boja, believed in discipline before daybreak. He called it starting her soul straight. The village called it tradition. He would slap her cheek once to wake her, sometimes twice if she stirred slowly. Then he would mutter something about laziness, about a girl needing to learn obedience before light touched the land. The room would be cold, the mat beneath her always damp from breath and dew. Her mother, Sarah, never stirred. If she did, it was only to tighten her shawl or turn her face to the wall. Kala never cried. Not even the first time, when she was 5 and had just come to live in Boja's house. Her real father had drowned in the Delta flood. Her mother remarried quickly after. Boja was the only man who offered both land and a house with strong walls. People praised Sarah for choosing wisely. But every morning since the wedding, the slap came. At first, Kala thought it was a mistake, something Boja would stop doing if she proved she could rise quickly enough, quietly enough. But no matter how early she tried to wake herself, he would still enter the room before the sky lightened, and his hand would still strike her cheek with the same quiet cruelty. No one questioned it. Not the neighbors. Not the other girls who saw the fading red marks at the village well. Not the aunties who laughed when Kala flinched at loud noises. It's just how men raise daughters, they said. Better a slap in the dark than shame in the light. So Kala kept count. At first it was numbers carved into the inside of her bamboo mat, scratched faintly with the edge of a chicken bone. One for each day. Later, when the marks began to blur, she started remembering by season. How many slaps it took before her cheek turned numb in winter, how many during the rains before her face stung for hours. By the time she turned 15, she had counted over 3,000 slaps. Not including the ones she received for other things, forgetting to fetch water, walking home too slow, humming to herself when the house was too quiet. But it was the morning slap that stayed with her most. The one that woke her. Boja was never cruel in front of others. He smiled with his lips closed. His words were always careful. When he beat her in front of her mother, not often but sometimes, it was for things that seemed reasonable to the watching eye. Her skirt was too long and caught on a branch. Her hands shook when grinding millet. She laughed during prayer. Always something small that became large under Boja's gaze. Sarah said little. Once, when Kala's lips split and bled onto the floor, her mother handed her a cloth without looking. "You must learn to move quietly," she whispered. "You must not provoke." Kala heard her mother weeping some nights, curled in her corner of the mat. But no one ever tried to stop Boja. Not even Sarah. There was no ceremony to this violence, no shouted fury, no drunken haze. Just routine. Just the belief that shaping a girl meant breaking her softness. But Kala did not break. Not really. Instead, she learned to separate herself from her body. She became two things, the girl who was struck and the one who watched it happen. The first wept in secret, the second never flinched. She existed in both places. Until one morning something shifted. It was a day like any other, the air heavy with mist, the frogs still croaking outside, the distant rustle of someone tending fire before light. Kala lay still on her mat waiting. She didn't want to rise too early. Boja had once slapped her for standing before he could teach her. She heard his steps. Measured. Confident. The door creaked. His breath hitched, always a half-second before the slap. But this time, as his hand lifted, Kala whispered something. Just loud enough for herself to hear. "I wish something would hit back." She didn't know why she said it. It slipped from her lips like steam rising from a bowl, barely real but full of heat. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't even rage. It was a wish. Quiet. Raw. Honest. Boja didn't seem to notice. The slap landed as usual. Her head turned. Her neck stung. But something inside her didn't return to stillness. Instead, she sat up slowly. Looked at the wall. There, her shadow stretched, pale and faint in the gloom. Only, it moved just a breath too late. A flicker. A delay. As if it too had turned its head a moment after hers, unsure whether to follow or rebel. Kala stared at it. She had seen her shadow every day since she could remember. But never had it moved wrong. Never had it felt uncertain. That day she worked as always. She swept the yard. She fetched water. She helped peel cassava until her fingers itched. But every time she turned, every time the light changed, she watched her shadow. And it watched her back. That night, she sat alone on the edge of the cooking hut, knees drawn to her chest. The moon hung low and fat in the sky. The stars trembled, dim behind drifting clouds. The fire had burned low behind her. And her shadow was darker than usual. Thicker. It lay beside her like a second skin stretched long. But something was off. The head tilted just slightly different. The fingers splayed with a sharpness she didn't recognize. It didn't echo her exactly. It lagged. It flickered. "Are you waiting?" she whispered. The wind didn't answer. But the trees rustled in a rhythm that sounded too much like breath. Kala looked down again and saw her shadow's hand curl, slow and small, into a fist. Just for a moment. She blinked. The hand was flat again. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, listening to her mother's breathing, to the frogs, to the wind, and to the quiet shifting of her shadow on the wall, soft as thought, sharp as waiting. When the first signs of dawn began to touch the sky, she closed her eyes and murmured again, "I wish something would hit back." The slap always came before the first bird cried out. It was the punctuation mark that woke the world in Kala's house. Not the soft creak of the rafters. Not the hiss of fire being coaxed into life. Not the rooster's call from the neighbor's coop. Just the sharp strike of Boja's palm on her skin. It was not loud to the ears of others, but inside her skull, it echoed like a drum. But after the slap and before the sun's climb, there was something else. Something Kala had started calling the cold hour. It began with breath. Hers, shallow and tight in her chest, trying not to shake from the sting. Boja would leave immediately after, muttering something about chores and silence and the wickedness of slow girls. His footsteps would fade across the yard, and the house would settle into a silence too wide to be safe. This hour between pain and morning was unlike any other part of the day. The light was not quite light. The shadows not quite shadows. The world itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something unnamed. At first, Kala would curl back into herself, pressing her cheek into the mat, trying to chase the pain away with stillness. But in recent weeks she had stopped lying back down. She'd begun sitting upright, legs crossed, hands on her knees, watching the thin sliver of sky through the broken eaves of the roof. Her breath formed a mist, though it was not cold outside. Her skin prickled as if a storm was close, though the air was dry and still. She called it the cold hour because it felt like the world had forgotten how to be warm. And in that hour strange things began to happen. It began with small flickers. She would stretch her arm to touch the water pot, and see her shadow reach for it a half-second later. Or she would turn her head, and for a heartbeat, her shadow didn't turn. It remained looking the other way as if distracted by something only it could see. Then came the reflection. At the back of the house, near the plantains, was a shallow basin filled by rainwater. It had been there for years, catching runoff from the thatch. Kala passed it every morning on her way to wash her face. One morning during the cold hour she looked down and gasped. She was still 2 paces from the basin, but her reflection was already there, staring up at her. Not waiting. Already watching. She stepped forward slowly. The reflection shimmered, adjusted to match her, but not immediately. Like a bad echo. Like it had been doing something else before she arrived. She knelt down and touched the water. The reflection blinked, not when she did but before. It was a moment's difference but unmistakable. Kala's breath caught in her throat. She stood and backed away. The reflection lingered, then rippled out. She told no one. Who would she tell? Her mother, who walked like the weight of Boja's silence was tied around her throat. The other village girls who barely looked her in the eye anymore. No one had seen the handprint-shaped bruises on her ribs. No one had heard her whisper in the dark, "I wish something would hit back." No one would believe her now if she said her reflection moved first. So she watched. Each morning she gave herself fully to the cold hour, letting it settle into her bones, letting her eyes adjust to the world that waited between darkness and light. The air held a heaviness during that hour that didn't belong to time. It belonged to something older. Something listening. Her shadow grew bolder. One morning she stood in the doorway, light from the cooking fire behind her. Her shadow stretched long across the courtyard, thin and flat on the packed earth. But as she moved forward, it didn't move with her. It stood still. She paused, turned, lifted her hand slowly. Her shadow lifted its hand too, but not in sync. Not immediately. There was a pause. A deliberate delay. As if it was thinking. As if it was watching her first. She clenched her fist. So did it. The wind rose slightly. Dust shifted at her feet. She didn't move again. Only breathe. Her breath came out in small white clouds, too cold for the dry season. And the birds were still silent. The rooster, her village's great timekeeper, had not made a sound. She backed away. Her shadow snapped to attention, returned to her feet as if it had never lingered. That night she didn't sleep. She waited again for the cold hour, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest. She watched the way the moonlight crept into the cracks of the wall, watched how the shadows of things long dead flickered like memory on the stone floor. In the corner, the broom's shadow twitched. Not the broom. The shadow. She stood and crossed to it, picked up the broom. It was still. But the shadow had moved, she was sure of it. She touched the handle. Her own shadow lay to her left, but it bent slightly in the wrong direction. The next day she went to the river. The sun was already climbing, but Kala dipped her hands in slowly. Watched her reflection in the rippling water. It looked like her. It blinked when she blinked. But something behind its eyes seemed to twitch. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. But with knowing. That evening she took a sharp stick and drew lines in the dirt. One for each morning she had woken in pain. One for each cold hour she had survived. One for every time her shadow moved wrong. Then she sat. The hour came again. And this time when she looked down at her shadow, she spoke. "Are you learning?" she asked. The shadow shifted. Not an answer. Not yet. But it was listening. And she knew, with a certainty that crept up her spine like ice, that something inside that darkness was beginning to understand her pain. Not as something to be pitied, but as something that could be returned. Ask ChatGPT. Kala never knew where her bruises would bloom. When Boja beat her, he didn't always leave marks. But when he did, they should have followed reason. A slap on the face, a welt on the cheek. A strike on the back, bruises along the spine. But Kala's bruises had begun to migrate, moving like shadows across her body. She would wake with pain where she hadn't been struck, and find her skin clean where she'd been hit the day before. Her cheek, bright red in the cold hour, would be clear by morning. But her left arm, untouched, would turn the color of old plums. She'd stopped showing her mother. Sarah wouldn't look anyway. She had grown too used to silence. She wore her own form of stillness like a shawl, one stitched from years of fear and a desperate belief in peace at any cost. But Kala noticed. And more than that, she began to map the bruises in her mind. One week, a blow to the back of her thigh reappeared under her rib the next day. Another time, a shove that landed on her shoulder migrated to her stomach. She began waking up in the night with aches in places untouched. Some nights, she swore she heard the bruises moving beneath her skin, like something crawling just under the surface. And the walls. The walls changed too. It began near her sleeping mat. At first it looked like soot. A smudge from an old cookpot perhaps, or dirt blown in by the wind. But when she touched it, her fingertips came away clean. The wall felt smooth, cold, but the stain remained. It was not dirt. It was not ash. It looked like fingerprints. Long, black marks, clustered in strange places, just above her mat, on the corner post, near the base of the door. At first they were faint, no more than whispers of shadow. But over time they darkened, thickened, spread. One night she counted 11. All the same size. Thin and long, like someone had leaned over her in the dark, pressing their fingers against the clay as they watched her sleep. She tried washing them away. Boiled water. Ash soap. A brush from the market made of river reeds. Nothing changed. The wall absorbed her efforts like it was feeding on them. The smudges stayed. The next morning, Boja shoved her for stepping into his path on the way to the yam patch. His hand caught her shoulder and she stumbled into the wall. The smudges shifted. They darkened instantly, flaring black like ink spilled in oil. She pulled back, heart pounding. When she looked again, the wall was calm, but now bore a single dark handprint just above where her shoulder had touched. That night, she dreamt of someone standing over her bed, their fingers reaching down, not to harm, but to mark. She began checking the walls each morning. Her mat became the center of a slow-moving halo of shadowy fingerprints. Sometimes they seemed to arrange themselves in patterns, spirals, lines, little constellations that vanished by afternoon and returned by dusk. By the second week, she stopped sleeping fully. She lay still, breathing shallow, eyes barely closed. The house was too quiet. Not the peaceful kind. Not the rest after work kind. The kind of quiet that presses into the skin, that hums behind the teeth. The kind of quiet that feels like a question being asked again and again without words. Boja didn't notice the walls. He never noticed anything he didn't strike. But Sarah did. One evening, as she was laying a bowl of water near the fire pit, she paused. Her eyes drifted to the corner where Kala slept. Her hand hovered. She said nothing. But that night, she moved her own mat closer to the doorway, farther from the darkened edges of the wall. 2 days later, the bruises on Kala's back, from a beating that left her windless and sore, vanished by midday. When she went to wash, she found instead a fresh blue mark wrapped around her wrist like a cuff. She hadn't been touched there. And the walls bore a new shape, 2 long vertical smudges with a line slashing through them like a scar. She went to the river and sat with her knees drawn to her chest, hair hiding her face. She dipped her hands into the water and asked it, without voice, "What is happening to me?" The water gave no answer. But her reflection shifted again, only this time it was smiling. Just faintly. That evening the healer arrived. His name was Tenio, an old man with clouded eyes and bones that popped when he walked. He had delivered half the village and buried the other half. He didn't come often anymore, only when summoned by the council or the priest. But this time, Sarah had sent for him quietly, slipping coins wrapped in cloth into a boy's palm and pointing him toward the hill. Kala was not asked if she wanted to be seen. She only knelt in the center of the hut while Tenio walked the perimeter. He did not greet her. He only hummed, clicked his tongue, tapped the walls. Then he crouched beside her. He reached out with thin, knotted fingers and placed one hand on her back, right where the bruises should have been. He frowned, shifted his hand, frowned again. "Your skin holds no heat," he said. She said nothing. He leaned close. "Where are the wounds?" Kala turned her head slightly, offering him her cheek. "He strikes here." Tenio peered, ran his thumb gently across her face. The skin was smooth. Well, no trace of harm. "Where do you hurt?" he asked. "Everywhere," she said quietly. "But not in the same place." He sat back. And then he looked at the wall. He did not touch it, not right away. But he squinted, leaned in close. His fingers hovered. His lips pressed together. "There are marks," he murmured. "Here and here." He pointed. "But they are not smears. Not soot. These are pressed. Imprinted." Kala stayed silent. He turned to Sarah. "When did the girl begin showing signs?" Sarah did not answer directly. Her hands were shaking. She looked at the floor. Tenio looked back at Kala. "Has anyone been here? Anyone from outside the village?" "No." "Has she been ill?" "No." He stood. "This house is too quiet," he said. He stepped toward the door. "Too still. Too careful. Something here is listening." Kala raised her head. "Listening to who?" Tenio paused. "You." He turned and walked out. That night Kala could not sleep. The house felt tight as though the walls had moved closer. The air pulsed. Her own heartbeat sounded distant, drowned by a low, humming breath beneath the silence. The smudges returned. She counted them. 13 now. 13 black marks all around her mat. They weren't threatening. They weren't kind. They were witnesses. And in that cold space between midnight and dawn, Kala whispered again into the dark, "Are you waiting for him to do it again?" The shadows didn't move. But the next morning Boja raised his hand late. Not because of hesitation. But because something in the corner caught his eye. A handprint on the wall, larger than his. Higher than a man could reach. Black as coal. It hadn't been there the night before. Dust always returned. No matter how many times Kala swept the courtyard, it came back, as if the ground itself had no interest in being clean. Every night before the house sank into silence, she would take the straw broom and make slow, circling motions around the yard. The dust was pale, the color of bone, and it never clung to the walls or plants. It settled in the open like it wanted to be seen. Like it wanted to hide something beneath. It was during this sweeping that the voice came. She was alone, as she always was in the evening. Her mother had long since curled near the fire, eyes vacant, arms curled around her knees. Boja had not yet returned from wherever men like him disappeared to after supper, sometimes to drink, sometimes to spread his teeth in village meetings, always to avoid being seen with her once the day's work ended. Kala's arms moved steadily, brushing dust from the center of the yard toward the dry root lines along the edges. It was a mindless task, one she had performed so many times that she no longer noticed how it had shaped her hands. Hard calluses along her palms, soft burns on the creases of her fingers. That night there was no wind. The trees stood stiff as though listening. The sky had no stars. And from behind her, just over her shoulder, came a whisper, "Kala." She dropped the broom. It wasn't a loud sound. It wasn't angry or urgent. Just a breath of her name, shaped softly, like it belonged to someone who once held her hand. But it was wrong in how close it had sounded. Wrong in how gently it had spoken. She turned. There was no one. No figure standing in the doorway. No shadow fleeing around the corner. Nothing. Except her own shadow, stretched impossibly long across the dirt, was curled at the edges, warped like smoke. It did not match her posture. She stood frozen, but her shadow was leaning forward slightly, like it was listening, or speaking. She took a step back. The shadow did not follow. Its hands remained lifted, fingers outstretched in a gesture she couldn't name. Kala bent and picked up the broom, her fingers trembling slightly. She resumed sweeping, but now each stroke was shallow. Her eyes flicked again and again to her shadow. Moved. Not with her. On its own. She took 3 deliberate steps to the left. The shadow followed, but 2 seconds too late, as if struggling to catch up. Then it stopped again. The hands curled inward. That night, she did not enter the house when she was done. She stood at the edge of the courtyard, just beyond the firelight, looking at where her shadow met the dust. "I heard you," she whispered. "Say it again." But the air remained still. The dust did not stir. Inside, her mother had begun snoring lightly. A bird cried out once, then went silent. Kala turned to go. Just before she crossed the threshold of the doorway, she glanced back. Her shadow was gone. She looked down. Nothing. No outline. The moon was clear. The sky was open. But the shadow was nowhere. A chill crept down her back. She stepped quickly inside. That night, the smudges on the wall around her mat grew darker. Not in size but in sharpness. Clearer outlines, sharper prints, some now shaped like fingers curling inward. She closed her eyes but did not sleep. In the morning she rose early. The rooster hadn't crowed yet, but something in her bones told her the time had come. She sat up, bare feet pressing to the cold floor. The light was soft, not enough to fully reveal the room, just enough to paint shadows against the mud walls. She looked down. Her shadow had returned. It was still, but different. Its posture was alert, as though standing on the edge of breath. Then came the door's creak. Boja entered. His steps were the same, confident, loud, expecting. Kala remained seated. His hand rose. The familiar gesture. Quick. Routine. But it paused. Midair. Just a fraction longer than it ever had. As if something held his wrist back for the space of a heartbeat. Kala looked up. Their eyes met. His were clouded by sleep or drink, or perhaps some small awareness that things were no longer entirely in his grasp. His hand shook. Then it dropped. He said nothing. Turned. Walked out. She did not move for a long time. Outside, birds began to stir. The sky lightened from purple to bruised gold. The rooster called late. She finally stood, slowly stretching her limbs. She turned toward the courtyard, stepped outside, and saw the broom had moved. It now leaned against the old water barrel. She hadn't left it there. She walked over, picked it up, laid it across her palms. A single black hair curled around the handle, tied in a knot. She hadn't tied it. That day Kala said nothing. But the village began to notice her in ways they hadn't before. At the well, children stopped their games when she arrived. An old woman bowed her head slightly as Kala passed. The market seller who once refused to meet her gaze now handed her a small yam without asking for coin. Boja stayed gone longer that night. When he returned, his face was damp with sweat. He didn't meet her eyes. At supper he dropped his bowl. When she bent to pick it up, he flinched just slightly. That night the wind came. A dry, rustling wind that shook only the leaves above her window, nowhere else. The dust in the courtyard stirred into a spiral. And within it, for the briefest moment, she saw her shadow rise, not from the ground but into it, as if sinking backward into the earth. And just before it vanished, she thought she saw it turn its head toward her, smile and whisper again, "Kala." But this time it sounded proud. It wasn't the slap that didn't come first. It was the sound that should have come before it. For years, Kala's mornings were timed by the crowing of the village rooster, a shrill, arrogant sound that echoed across the huts and fields. It always came before sunrise, like a herald of punishment, calling Boja awake just in time to rise, stalk across the house, and strike her into mourning. That rooster never failed. Even when the sky wept with storms or the air was too thick to breathe, it would cry from the top of its coop, splitting silence with its blade of sound. But not today. This morning there was nothing. No crow. No flapping wings. No slap. Just silence. Kala lay still on her mat, staring up at the low beams of the ceiling, and for the first time in years she realized she was not bracing for pain. She blinked, moved her fingers, tensed her jaw. Still nothing. The house didn't stir. Boja didn't come. Her mother didn't rise. Outside, the birds chirped late like they too had overslept. Kala sat up slowly. She waited, certain Boja would burst in and accuse her of idleness, curse her for daring to rest longer than the sun. But the door remained closed. The only sound was the soft hiss of morning wind moving through papaya leaves. Felt wrong. She stood, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and padded across the floor. She stepped outside and looked toward the animal pens. The rooster's perch was empty. The coop's door hung slightly open. Feathers, white and streaked with dust, littered the ground like something had taken flight, or been taken. She felt no pity. Only the strange awareness that a part of the world's rhythm had broken. Her routine had shifted. The drumbeat of her suffering had skipped a beat. She was awake, alone, and unstruck. She looked down. Her shadow stood right beneath her, longer than it should have been, even though the sun had barely risen. It curled gently around her feet, like it was wrapping itself to her body for warmth. She stepped forward. The shadow followed. But not just as it always had. It followed closer. Too close. When she walked through the yard, her shadow didn't trail behind. It clung, bending unnaturally around her, staying beneath her even when the angle of light suggested it should stretch away. At the fire pit, she crouched to stir the ashes. A coal flared. The light flickered. And her shadow blinked. She saw it. Just a flicker. The shape of its head dipped too fast, the edge of its shoulder lifted when hers stayed still. She stood. Stepped backward. It mirrored her now with eerie precision, but she knew what she had seen. She stepped out onto the road toward the village well. The sun had crested halfway up the trees by the time she arrived. Most girls had only just begun to gather, their chatter lower than usual, the rhythm of the day clearly disrupted by the rooster's silence. Kala set her pot down beside the well and waited. She didn't speak. The other girls barely glanced her way. But one, a tall girl with silver rings in her ears, stared longer than the rest. She stood beside Kala as they each waited their turn. "You're late," the girl said without malice. "No one woke me," Kala answered. The girl nodded. Rooster didn't crow. Kala said nothing. She felt her shadow curled around her again, an unnatural comfort at her feet. Then the girl gasped. Kala turned sharply. "What?" The girl stepped back. "It blinked," she whispered. Kala's heart dropped. "What did?" The girl pointed downward, her mouth open. "Your shadow. Its head moved like it was watching." Kala stared at the ground. Her shadow looked the same. Flat. Still. Quiet. But something in its posture had changed. Kala turned away. Drew water. Left before the girl could speak again. She walked slowly back to her house, eyes flicking between the dust, the trees, the sunlight. The world felt a step out of place. Nothing looked wrong, but nothing felt right. When she reached the threshold of the yard, she paused. There, etched into the dirt beside the water barrel, were footprints. But not like any she'd seen. They were narrow, long. And they didn't start from the gate. They simply began near her mat and ended at the coop. Beside them, black feathers. She stepped over them and entered the house. Boja was seated by the hearth. His back to her. Silent. Not eating. Not muttering. His posture was stiff, like he hadn't moved in hours. She passed him without a word and returned to her corner. That night, sleep came in pieces, scattered and jagged. She closed her eyes and opened them into another place. The room. Endless. Walls made of polished glass, as smooth as still lakes and as tall as trees. Each one reflected nothing. No light. No face. No Kala. She stood barefoot on a dark floor that felt like silk and ash. Her breath echoed, but the room had no sound. She stepped toward the nearest mirror. It remained blank. She lifted her hand. The mirror remained smooth, but behind the surface something moved. Not her reflection. Not her. But a shape, similar wrong. Its eyes were open. It smiled. Kala stepped back. Turned. Every mirror around her remained empty, except for faint flickers deep within. Images that moved out of sync, eyes that stared too long, mouths that whispered without sound. She spun slowly in place, feeling the weight of their gazes. Then, in one mirror, straight ahead, something stepped forward. Her shadow. It took the form of her shape, yes, but more complete. Its limbs sharper, its jaw set firm. It did not blink. It did not flinch. It raised its hand. Kala raised hers. Not to match, but in defense. Because the shadow's palm curved forward like a slap. Kala woke gasping. Her cheek stung, not with pain but with warmth, like something had brushed her just before waking. She sat upright. The walls were quiet. The smudges now covered the entire length beside her mat. And on the floor, drawn in ash, was a line of black feathers leading to the doorway, and stopping. Kala stood slowly. Walked to the threshold. Looked out into the night. The moon was hidden. The The stars were small. And at her feet, her shadow leaned forward slightly, hands curled, like it was waiting for her to say something. But she had no words left. Only the question burning in her chest. If she no longer woke to his slap, was something, or someone, slapping him instead? The morning began like all the others before it, dark, quiet, and breathless. The cold hour hung thick in the air, that strange stretch of time between night and sunrise when even the wind seemed unsure whether to move. Kala sat on her mat, awake as she often was now, long before Boja stirred. She didn't brace for the slap anymore. She didn't fold herself small or hide her face. She sat upright, spine long, eyes open, watching the dark corners of the room shift in silence. Outside no rooster called. The feathers still hadn't returned to the coop. The village had taken to waking late, unsure whether to speak of the missing cries or pretend the sun's delay wasn't real. Inside, Kala waited. She didn't know what for. She only knew that something had changed. Not yesterday, not last week, but steadily, slowly, like how a flood begins with one unnoticed drop of rain. She heard his footsteps. Not rushed. Not angry. Just the same. His rhythm hadn't changed. But hers had. Boja pushed the door open. It creaked the way it always did. The boards under his feet moaned softly as he stepped toward her corner. His face was unreadable in the half-dark, but Kala didn't need to see his eyes to know the rest of the morning. He raised his hand. She didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't look away. And that's when it happened. The sound came as expected, a sharp, flat slap that rang out in the stillness. But it didn't come alone. There was a second sound. Almost the same. Just a half-second behind. Another slap. Echoed. Returned. Boja's hand landed on her cheek, but at the same moment, a second sound cracked through the air, deeper, heavier, and Boja stumbled backward. He clutched his face. Kala didn't understand at first. She hadn't moved. Her hands were at her sides. She hadn't touched him. But Boja's eyes were wide, full of something he didn't have a name for. He brought his hand away from his face. His cheek was red. Not faintly. Not as if from heat or embarrassment. But the full bloom of a slap. One that had landed clean and cruel. He looked down at Kala, trembling. "What?" he began. But Kala didn't answer. She was frozen. Because something was behind her. Not someone. Not anything she could name. But a presence, thick and heavy, like breath just over her shoulder. She dared to glance sideways toward the floor. Her shadow moved. Its fingers were curling slowly into a fist. Boja backed away further, nearly tripping over the low bench by the door. Kala's cheek stung, but she barely felt it. She stood. The air was colder now, and she felt the sharp breath of something close to her skin, but she didn't shiver. Her shadow remained at her feet, but it was alive. Not flickering. Not following. Leading. Boja looked from her to the floor, to the wall, to the dark smudges that now covered the corner like fingerprints pressed by time itself. His lips trembled, but no words came. He turned and fled. The door slammed behind him. Kala remained standing in the stillness. The second slap still echoed in her mind, louder than the first. Not just a sound of pain, but a sound of justice. A sound that had waited far too long to arrive. She looked down again. Her shadow's fist slowly unclenched. And for the first time since she was 5 years old, Kala allowed herself to smile. Boja no longer looked at her. Not when she entered the room. Not when she passed him in the yard. Not even when she brought water for her mother and brushed near him. He flinched now, like a man who expected to be struck, and never knew when or how it would come. He'd begun sleeping facing the wall, curled awkwardly, his back tight as rope. The heavy man who once roared with morning slaps now mumbled to himself in dusk. The villagers whispered, but no one asked what had changed. But Kala knew. She saw the bruises on his arms. At first she thought they were tricks of the light. Then she noticed their shapes, long, narrow marks that looked like fingerprints. Some curled around his wrist, some pressed beneath his elbow, some too high on his back to reach on his own. They darkened each morning and faded by night, only to return again. The same way her bruises used to appear. But these didn't drift away like hers. They multiplied. Kala didn't say anything. She had no need. Because she was no longer walking alone. Her shadow followed her, yes, but it no longer stayed close. It stretched beyond her, reaching through alleys, bending around doorways, pressing along the corners of walls where sunlight should have broken it apart. Even when the sun stood directly overhead, Kala's shadow leaned slightly sideways as if choosing its own path. Children noticed first. They stared when she passed. One boy cried when he stepped into her shadow and felt the air go cold. His mother pulled him away without apology. And Kala saw them, the eyes of the village finally paying attention. They did not know what they were seeing, only that it unsettled them. Women at the well drew back as Kala approached. A market elder who used to ignore her now blessed himself quickly as she passed. Her own mother, Sarah, had begun lighting small lamps in the daylight, as if afraid of what dark corners might grow. But Kala walked taller. She wasn't afraid of the shadow, because it remembered every slap, every night, every bruise that had wandered across her body like a question no one would answer. Her shadow knew, and it did not forget. The shrine stood at the edge of the village, surrounded by 7 trees. Kala went there one morning not for forgiveness but out of curiosity. She wanted to see if the gods looked different to her now, or if she looked different to them. The priest, old and bent, saw her from afar. He stepped outside the shrine before she reached it. He shook his head. "You cannot come here," he said. Kala stopped walking. "Why?" He pointed to the ground near her feet. Her shadow stretched toward the shrine steps, curling up one stone, reaching toward the carved altar behind him. The priest's eyes narrowed. "Because shadows do not forget," he said. "And neither should you." Kala looked down. Her shadow curled gently at the edges, like smoke from an old fire. "What do you think I've remembered?" she asked. The priest didn't answer. He turned and went back inside, leaving her outside with the 7 trees and the silent gods. Kala did not enter. She did not need to. That evening the wind stirred low in the yard. Boja tried to leave the house without speaking. His steps were careful. He opened the door slowly. And as he passed the wall, his body jerked. Like something had grabbed him by the shoulder. He spun but there was no one. Only a long black mark trailing up the doorframe, new wet-looking but cold as stone when Kala touched it. That night as she lay down to sleep, Kala whispered into the darkness beside her mat. "Do you remember what he said to me when I cried?" The shadow on the wall curled. Its fingers pressed to the clay gently. Kala closed her eyes. She didn't smile. She just breathed. Because something else was breathing with her now. Asked ChatGPT. That night, sleep came slowly. Kala lay on her mat, staring at the ceiling beams as wind tapped against the shutters like long, tired fingers. Her mother didn't stir, and Boja's breath wheezed unevenly from the far corner of the house. Shadows crowded the walls, thick and soft, not menacing but not still either. She didn't remember closing her eyes. But she opened them into a place she had never seen, and yet somehow always known. The hut stood at the farthest edge of the village, in the place where paths ended and dust turned to weeds. It had no door, no light. They called it the mirror house, though few remembered why. Children said it was where shadows went when they became too heavy. Elders said it was where people saw truths they had no name for. In the dream, Kala walked barefoot across the threshold. The air inside was cold but sweet. Not like wind but like breath after weeping. The walls were made of wood but polished smooth, not with oil but with time. And the mirrors were not glass. They were surfaces, flat, dark and glimmering like water at night. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. Some upright. Some tilted. Some broken. Kala stepped forward. In the first mirror she saw herself, or something like herself. Her reflection blinked before she did. In the next, it turned its head before hers moved. In the third, the reflection smiled first. They weren't mimicking her. They were waiting for her. She stepped deeper into the mirror house, her bare feet making no sound. Every surface she passed showed a different version of herself. Older, younger, laughing, afraid. Some limped. Some stood tall. One was bruised and weeping. Another held a knife. She turned a corner and stopped. At the far end of the hut, a single panel stood alone, taller than all the others. Its surface was not glass but shadow. It pulsed. Kala approached slowly. Her own form was reflected there, but it was made of smoke and dark lines. No face. Just a silhouette. It moved slightly as she did, but not quite at the same time. She stepped closer. And then it stepped forward. Out of the mirror. Her shadow peeled itself from the surface like skin from wet cloth. It stood before her, same height, same posture, same outline, but fuller now, sharper. Its fingers were long hands poised like a dancer's. They stood facing each other. "You gave me reason," it said. The voice wasn't loud but it came from everywhere. Floor, ceiling, mirror, chest. Kala swallowed. "I didn't mean to." The shadow tilted its head. "But you did. I only wanted it to stop." "It did," the shadow said. "And now I remain." Kala reached a hand forward. The shadow didn't flinch. Its own hand rose to meet hers, not mirroring but matching. They touched. The surface was cool, not cold. Like morning water. Like stone left in shade. Now give me shape, it said. What does that mean? Kala asked. The shadow looked down. Around them the mirrors began to shift. The reflections within each turned to face her. Some lifted their hands. Some opened their mouths but made no sound. You shaped me with pain, the shadow whispered. Shape me now with truth. Kala's eyes burned. Her throat ached. She had never said the words out loud. Not to anyone. Not even to herself. But here, in this place between dreams and memory, she nodded. I was never weak, she said. The shadow inhaled, a slow, soft draw of breath. Its shoulders straightened. I was only made small. The mirrors shivered. One cracked down the center. I was hurt and I endured. That's not shame. The shadow stepped closer. Its feet now touched the ground. Kala reached for its face. There were no eyes, but the outline shimmered. Then say my name, it said. Kala thought for a long moment. And then, from the center of her chest, she whispered, mine. The mirror house fell silent. And the shadow stepped into her. Not behind. Not beside. And Kala gasped awake. She sat upright in her mat, sweat beading at her temples. Around her the house slept. But when she stood, her shadow stood with her, taller, bolder, and completely still. Kala walked into the village just after dawn. The mist still clung to the ground like it was afraid to leave. Smoke rose from cooking fires, thin and unhurried. The rooster had not returned, and people now woke not from crowing, but from something else, dreams they didn't understand and a coldness behind their ears they could not shake. Kala's feet were bare. She carried a shallow clay bowl filled with black ash, mixed with oil until it glistened like obsidian. She didn't speak. She didn't explain. She didn't ask for permission. Her first stop was the outer wall of the healer's hut. He hadn't slapped her. But he had seen the bruises and said nothing. He had touched her shoulder and said, this house is too quiet, then turned away. She dipped her hands into the ash, fingers, palms, up to the wrist. It dripped thick down her arms. Then she pressed her palms against the wall. When she stepped back, two prints remained. Dark, steady, waiting. Her shadow stepped forward. It reached up and mimicked her motion but left no stain. Still, the wall darkened as if it remembered something that had happened long ago. Kala turned and walked on. Next was the house of the woman who once told Kala's mother to keep the child's crying quiet, because her own baby couldn't sleep through the noise. Kala placed her hands on that wall too. Then another, the courtyard where Boja had once beaten her in the open, and the men turned their eyes away, pretending to be busy with wood and nails. She marked that wall. And another. And another. With each print, her hands grew darker but lighter. Her body no longer trembled under the weight of silence. The weight was in the ash now, spread, shared, seen. Children began to follow her. They didn't speak at first. They only watched. But as she moved from house to house, they began whispering to each other. She's marking the ones who let it happen. She's showing the walls what they missed. She's not alone. Behind her, the shadow grew longer, even though the sun was high. It touched the same walls. Sometimes it lingered. Its hands hovered inches from the clay, and the surface darkened anyway, as if absorbing a memory it had tried to forget. That night, the village did not sleep easily. Children woke crying but not from fear. They told their mothers of a girl who visited their dreams, a girl with dark hands and quiet eyes, who pressed her palms to their hearts and whispered, remember what you are worth. And in some dreams she struck. Not the dreamer but the wicked, faceless men with large hands and cruel mouths. The girl raised her own hand and her shadow followed, and the sound of the slap echoed 3 times. The next morning no one spoke Kala's name aloud. But no one erased the prints. Not even the ones whose homes had been marked. By midday her stepfather was gone. The neighbors saw him leave just after sunrise, hunched, carrying only a wrapped bundle under one arm. His face was blotched with color, and his eyes darted like a man being followed, though no one trailed him. Except, perhaps, his own guilt. Kala stood in the center of the village as he disappeared over the hill. Her shadow stood beside her. Not behind. Beside. And the village breathed differently after that. No louder. But deeper.